Israel wants to be the regional power unchallenged by anybody in the region. And if that means crushing another powerful country, well, get the U.S. to do it. And when Israel already in this case, 22 years ago, it was talking about Hamas and Hezbollah the same way. And it was saying, well, we have to take out all of their supporters. We have to take out Assad in Syria. We have to take out Saddam because he's an unstable dictator, and he should have been not only defeated in 1990, but overthrown in regime change. We need to take out Iran. When we as Americans think back to 2003, we think of the Iraq War and all of the disaster that it caused us and the trillions of dollars of losses and debt that we incurred and all the veterans that came back either dead or mangled. We think of that, but we don't see it quite as a sequence because, it was 8 years after going into Iraq that the second stage of the plan actually began with taking out the Syrian regime. Why an 8-year gap? Because according to the very insightful and wise words of Dennis Fritz, a Marine commander who's written a book about all of this, we got stuck in Iraq in a way we didn't expect. Because the idea originally of Netanyahu was bulldoze Iraq and then move on to bulldoze Syria, then move on to bulldoze Iran. But the insurgency started, so we got stuck in Iraq. Then Obama in 2011, almost not known, not understood, hidden from view because it was a CIA operation. We took on Syria. The way we did it in that case was through proxies. It was through literal jihadists that the United States funded through the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Another, by the way, complete debacle, a complete failure. So when I say that Netanyahu's been selling us a line, he's been selling us a line for 25 years, which is reckless, which is costly, which is a failure. And he's doing it again. And it looks like, in his twilight days that Joe Biden's going to let Netanyahu do it again.
Jeffrey Sachs presents a stark critique of Israel's strategy to maintain dominance in the Middle East, pointing to a decades-long plan aimed at systematically weakening its neighbors. What's particularly alarming, according to Sachs, is Israel's ability to pull the U.S. into these conflicts, leaving America to bear the brunt of the military and financial burden. In this expanded discussion, we'll delve deeper into the stages of this plan, the regional consequences, and the broader geopolitical implications, exploring why Sachs believes this strategy has been not only reckless but consistently disastrous for the U.S. Sachs outlines how Israel's strategy for maintaining regional dominance has been clear for decades. The plan has been to systematically dismantle opposition in the region by eliminating or weakening powerful states that could challenge its authority. The key targets of this strategy were Iraq, Syria, and ultimately Iran, each of which was perceived as a threat to Israel's security and influence in the Middle East. The primary tool Israel has used to achieve this has been U.S. military intervention. This started with Iraq in 2003, where the goal was not simply to remove Saddam Hussein from power, but to permanently diminish Iraq as a regional power. But, as Sachs points out, the insurgency that followed the U.S. invasion created a quagmire, stalling the broader plan to destabilize other countries like Syria and Iran. The logic behind this strategy is simple. Israel cannot afford to have a strong rival in the region. Therefore, by systematically removing hostile regimes and supporting U.S.-led regime change efforts, Israel could cement its position as the unchallenged regional power. However, Sachs suggests that this strategy, while beneficial to Israel, has left the U.S. grappling with the long-term consequences of endless wars. One of Sachs' most striking points is how the U.S. became entangled in Iraq much longer than expected. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, initiated under the pretense of eliminating weapons of mass destruction and bringing democracy to the region, quickly spiraled into chaos. The U.S. faced fierce resistance from insurgents, creating a drawn-out and costly occupation that stretched far beyond the initial mission. Sachs argues that this insurgency effectively stuck the U.S. in Iraq, delaying Israel's broader plan. The cost of the Iraq War has been astronomical, both in terms of financial resources and human lives. By some estimates, the war has cost the U.S. over $2 trillion, with thousands of American soldiers dead or injured, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives lost. This prolonged occupation also created a power vacuum, fueling sectarian violence and enabling the rise of extremist groups like ISIS. Instead of achieving stability, the war plunged Iraq into greater chaos. Sachs emphasizes that the U.S., which bore the brunt of these failures, didn't fully understand that the Iraq War was part of a larger Israeli-led strategy. By 2011, with Iraq still in turmoil, attention shifted to Syria. According to Sachs, Israel viewed Syria under President Bashar al-Assad as another key target that needed to be neutralized in order to secure its dominance in the region. However, unlike Iraq, the U.S. approach to Syria was more covert, relying on a proxy war rather than direct military intervention. Sachs describes how the CIA, through various operations, funneled money and arms to jihadist groups with the aim of toppling Assad. This strategy led to one of the bloodiest civil wars in modern history, with over 500,000 Syrians killed and millions more displaced. Despite these efforts, the goal of regime change in Syria was never fully realized. Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, managed to retain power, further demonstrating the failure of the U.S. and Israel's strategy. Sachs criticizes this approach, describing it as yet another complete debacle. The conflict in Syria, much like Iraq, spiraled into chaos, with multiple factions battling for control and no clear winner emerging. The humanitarian cost of the Syrian civil war has been immense, but the political objectives behind it, namely, weakening Assad and Iran's influence in the region, were never achieved. At the heart of Sachs' analysis is the role that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has played in shaping U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Netanyahu has consistently advocated for U.S. military action to weaken Israel's enemies, particularly Iran, and his influence over U.S. decision-making has been profound. Netanyahu's argument is straightforward. Israel faces existential threats from its neighbors, and the U.S., as Israel's closest ally, has a responsibility to neutralize these threats. In Sachs' view, however, this has led to a dangerously one-sided relationship, where the U.S. is repeatedly drawn into conflicts that primarily benefit Israel, while bearing most of the cost. Sachs suggests that Netanyahu's influence has led the U.S. into a series of failed military interventions, from Iraq to Syria, with Iran potentially being the next target. Sachs questions whether this strategy is sustainable, pointing out that each conflict has left the U.S. in a worse position than before, while Israel continues to push for more aggressive action against its adversaries. Sachs underscores the massive financial and human costs that the U.S. has paid in these conflicts. Since 2001, the U.S. has spent trillions of dollars on wars in the Middle East, with very little to show for it. In Iraq, the U.S. ended up empowering Iran by removing Saddam Hussein, while in Syria, efforts to overthrow Assad have only prolonged the suffering of the Syrian people without achieving any significant political gains. Veterans returning from these wars have often been left to deal with physical and psychological scars, and the long-term economic burden of these wars will continue to affect future generations of Americans. Despite this, the U.S. remains entangled in the region, with no clear exit strategy. Sachs questions the wisdom of continuing to follow a strategy that has proven so costly and ineffective. He argues that the U.S. needs to reassess its role in the Middle East and whether it should continue to act as Israel's military enforcer, especially when the benefits to the U.S. are so unclear. Sachs warns that Iran remains the ultimate target in Israel's strategy for regional dominance. Netanyahu has long pushed for regime change in Iran, viewing the country's nuclear ambitions and influence over groups like Hezbollah as existential threats to Israel. However, Sachs cautions that a direct military confrontation with Iran would be far more dangerous and unpredictable than previous conflicts. Iran's military capabilities, particularly its missile arsenal, mean that any conflict with Israel could escalate quickly into a regional war, potentially drawing in other powers like the US, Russia, and even China. In this context, Sachs emphasizes the need for diplomacy rather than military action. He suggests that continued pressure for regime change in Iran could lead to catastrophic consequences, not just for Israel and the US, but for the entire region. According to Jeffrey Sachs, Israel wants to be the regional power, unchallenged by anyone in the region, and if that means crushing another powerful country, they get the US to do it. Even 22 years ago, Israel was talking about Hamas and Hezbollah in the same way. They were saying, we have to take out all of their supporters. We have to take out Assad in Syria. We have to take out Saddam Hussein because he's an unstable dictator. Not only did they believe he should have been defeated in 1990, but that he should have been overthrown in a regime change. They also wanted to take out Iran. When we, as Americans, think back to 2003, we remember the Iraq War and the disaster it caused. The trillions of dollars in losses, the debt we incurred, and the veterans who came back either dead or severely injured. We think of that, but we don't often see it as part of a sequence. It was 8 years after the Iraq invasion that the second stage of the plan began, taking out the Syrian regime. Why the 8-year gap? According to the insightful words of Marine Commander Dennis Fritz, who wrote a book on this, we got stuck in Iraq in a way we didn't expect. The original idea, pushed by Netanyahu, was to bulldoze through Iraq, then move on to Syria, and finally to Iran. But the insurgency in Iraq stalled the plan. Then, in 2011, under Obama, the US took on Syria, but this time it was almost hidden from view because it was a CIA operation. We used proxies, literal jihadists funded by the CIA, to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. This, too, was a complete failure. So when I say Netanyahu has been selling us a reckless and costly plan for 25 years, that's exactly what he's been doing. And it looks like, in his twilight days, Joe Biden may let him do it again. Thanks for watching.